So it's a great joy for me to be here tonight and speak on the feminine genius, the beauty of God's design. And I'd like to begin this evening with a story about a woman and a butterfly. So one day, a woman found a cocoon of a butterfly, and she took it home. Every day she observed the tightly closed, magnificently woven masterpiece, until one day, whoop, a small opening appeared. And being a Sunday, and since the office was closed, she sat down and watched the butterfly for several hours as it struggled to force its body through the tiny opening. Then the butterfly seemed to stop making progress. It appeared to have gotten stuck. Ever feel like that in your life? I know, I sure do. It appeared to have gotten stuck and was able to go no further. So the woman, in her executive way, decided to help the butterfly. She took a pair of scissors and snip, snip. She created a larger opening in the cocoon. Well, then the butterfly emerged easily, but it had a swollen body and small shriveled wings. Well, the woman continued to watch the butterfly because she expected that at any moment, the wings would expand to be able to support the body, which would contract in time. This never happened. In fact, the butterfly spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and small, shriveled wings. It was never able to fly. You see, what the woman, in her help and her haste, did not understand was that the restricting cocoon and the struggle required for the butterfly to get through that tiny opening were God's way of forcing the fluid from the body of the butterfly into the wings so that it would be ready for flight once it emerged from the cocoon. I believe that in our culture today, we as women have been experiencing something similar to this butterfly. In fact, for the past 40 years or so, we've been told that God's design for woman is restrictive. It's oppressive. It's smothering us. So you know what? Get out those scissors and snip, snip. Get rid of it. Get rid of God and oppressive church rules. Get rid of motherhood. Get rid of fertility. Get rid of socially constructed gender roles, and then you'll be free. This is the message that has been presented to us over and over and over again for the last 40 or so years in many, many different ways. And instead of ending up free, because that's what we were promised, instead, I think we've ended up crippled. As women, we've ended up emotionally crippled, spiritually crippled, and relationally crippled. That's why, isn't it so wonderful to gather as women? Because, you know, we all carry wounds. And we all realize in one way or another, we've been crippled. And it's so life-giving to gather with other women and to begin that healing process, right? So we can stand up straight and walk as God created us and designed us to walk as women. So I think what's happened is that we often have ended up confused about what it means to be a woman. And likewise now confused about what it means to be a man. And confused about what is true equality. Because we're told that true equality means sameness all across the board. Everything the same. And if everything is not treated the same, somehow there's inequality. I hope that we'll see that God has a different design than that tonight. His design is absolutely equality, but not in the way that we understand equality through sameness. Instead, equality through the beauty of God's design. And that means it's voting time. Here we go. Here's what I'm going to ask you to vote on. How many of you would like to be a crippled butterfly crawling around with a swollen body and shriveled wings the rest of your life? Any takers? How many of you would rather struggle through the opening in the cocoon so that once you're out, your wings are beautiful and your body is beautiful and you can fly and be free? Who would prefer that? Fabulous. So would I. So we're all in the right place. Let's do that. So let's do a little bit of struggling today by looking at God's design for woman. And to do that, I want to ask you a question. here's the question. How many of you would call yourselves a feminist? So I'm seeing a couple hands here. Okay, so maybe some people, okay, they're willing to admit that. For the most of you, you weren't quite sure. Or you weren't willing to raise your hand, or you're like, oh no, I'm not a feminist. I'm not one of them. It's kind of a dangerous question, isn't it? Because you're probably not really sure what I mean by feminist, right? So I need to define my terms. I think that many of us, whether we realize it or not, there have actually been 4 waves of feminism. So you're right to demand that I define my terms. Because when I ask you if you're a feminist, it could mean many different things depending on which wave of feminism we're talking about. And so there have been 4 waves of feminism over the course of American history, and we're still in the midst of that 4th wave. So let's look at these 4 waves. I happen to be from San Diego, so I'm a little bit partial to an ocean image. So the first wave of feminism began in the any guesses? The first wave of feminism began in the when? The mid-60s. The mid-1800s. A little bit surprising, isn't it? Because in the mid-1800s, women could not own property, they could not get a college education, and they couldn't vote. So the modern women's movement in the United States actually began in the mid-1800s. And people like Susan B. Anthony struggled for the right for women to vote, but also for the dignified treatment of black men and women. See, in the mid-1980s, the mid-1800s, they understood this was about equality for all. It wasn't just about women getting the vote. It was about the equal dignity of every person. And so this is why in our country, remember at the one point in time we had the Susan B. Anthony silver dollar? That's why. She was instrumental in the beginning of the women's movement, the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism hit the shores of different countries in any guesses on this one? Very good. In the 1920s and 30s. So just depending on various countries throughout the world, it hit the shores of various countries in the 1920s and 30s. And the momentum of this second wave was geared toward educational and employment opportunities. Now this might seem like old hat to us, right? For women to earn PhDs and to be CEOs of their companies. But remember what it was like at the turn of the 20th century. It's not like it was today, like it is today. For instance, my grandmother was born in 1899, and she died in the year 2000. That means she was 101, and she lived through 3 centuries. Not many people can say that. And so her life, for me, has been so instructive to remember what it was like back in the 1920s, because I certainly didn't live through that time, and I don't think any of us here did either. So she was born in Massachusetts in a small town to a French-Canadian couple. And she lived in this small town, which was dominated by a cloth mill. Now, no woman in her town had ever been to college, ever. So this is in 1910, 1915. No woman had ever been to college. A banker in the town noticed my grandmother's quick mind and helped pay for her way to go to prestigious Smith College. So she was the first woman from her town to ever go to college, ever. She even went on an ocean liner by herself to Madrid, Spain, when she was 19 or 20. So that would have been like in 1919, 1918, by herself. And she was only about 4'10". So I think of the guts she had. She was an amazing woman, going to Spain by herself for a whole year. Then in the 1920s, she married my grandfather, and even though she had her college degree and had been a Spanish teacher, she had to quit work when she got married. She had to quit work. You see, it was not an option at that point in time to be married and work outside the home. Things that we take for granted almost 100 years later are the direct result of this second wave of feminism. So how about the third wave of feminism? Well, this is the feminism that I think most of us are familiar with, and it's what we could call radical feminism. And it emerged out of the cultural upheaval of the 60s and the 70s. So when I asked you when did feminism start, most of you said 1960s, right? But that's actually the third wave of feminism, which is why I know for me I find it so helpful to realize the movement over the course of time and how it has built. And so what we think of as feminism is really the third wave, which I prefer to call radical feminism. And so while the first and second wave feminism addressed some very important and unjust concerns, radical feminism seemed to get off track. Because frequently the focus of radical feminism has been to attack marriage and motherhood, and often to even deny masculinity and femininity. One of the emphases of radical feminism has been to gain equality, power, and reproductive rights. And in fact, the push has often been to free ourselves from our biology. That's kind of been one of the slogans of radical feminism, that to free ourselves from our biology. Biology is not destiny. That's the way it's often been said. And as a result, to get rid of the male-female distinction by saying, you know what, men and women really are just the same, and gender is imposed on us by our culture. And so gender is not something inherent to us, masculinity and femininity. No, no, no. It's something gender is imposed on us by our culture, and really, in reality, it's work and economic independence that give us our dignity. I'd like to quote from a 2007 book by Linda Hirschman, which is entitled, Get to Work. And notice the subtitle, and get a life before it's too late. This book, the author is treating the trend that her is a very disturbing trend of women leaving the workforce to return home to care for their children. Here's what she writes on page 2. Bounding home is not good for women, and it's not good for society. The women aren't using their capacities fully. Their so-called free choice makes them unfree dependents on their husbands. When they leave the workplace altogether or just cut back on their commitment, their talent and education are lost from the public world to the private world of laundry and kissing boo-boos. I don't know about you, but as a woman, whether I work outside the home or whether I'm staying at home, I feel a little bit insulted by saying that my only value is by working outside the home, and that my talents and my capacities are wasted if I choose to stay home and to form the lives of young men and women. I don't know if you can hear it, but when I read that, I can hear the snip, 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 snip. You know what? Let's get rid of that cocoon that restricts us as women. Let's get rid of everything that characterizes us as women. Let's get rid of our gender. Let's get rid of pregnancy. Let's get rid of our place in the home. And you know what? While we're at it, let's get rid of our fertility and call ourselves women. W-O-M-Y-N. This was really the trend now a number of years ago, that radical feminists didn't want to spell woman, W-O-M-A-N, because what was in the word woman? Man. And so some of them respelled it, W-O-Y-M-N, so that woman could be free to exist without any reference to man. Because the ideal is to be totally autonomous and independent and not need anyone, not even a man, not even for reproductive purposes. Thank you, we can take care of that just fine on our own. But this is the ideal of the woman, W-O-M-Y-N. I really wish that I was exaggerating. But unfortunately, at one point in time, this was a very important focus in radical feminism. I don't know about you, but does that sound like freedom to you? Does that sound like fulfillment? To be totally free and independent from everyone and everything, so that your whole world evolves around you and what you can accomplish in the workforce? It's not my definition of freedom and fulfillment. So I'd ask you for a moment to think about the various men in your life, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're a student, whether you're a grandmother, whether you've never been married, whether you're a widow. Think about the various men that you interact with in your life. Tell me, do men and boys talk about the same things as women and girls? It didn't take you long to answer that, did it? Do men talk about clothes and relationships? Do men talk about nails and hair and relationships? Do men talk about who likes who and relationships? You're getting the picture, aren't you? Do men watch the same kind of movies as women? Well, they might be forced to watch some of the movies that women watch, right? But if they had their preference, they'd much rather be watching Gladiator and Braveheart, right? How many of you have seen Gladiator and Braveheart? So a number of you, but notice not all of us. We would much rather be watching something like Princess Diaries, wouldn't we? Right? Or Pride and Prejudice, right? How many men look, oh, you're putting on Pride and Prejudice. Great, let me go get a beer and watch it with you. Right? It's not going to happen normally. How many of you have seen the movie Secretariat? How many of you loved it? Okay, for me, I saw it on a plane, and it was a 4 Kleenex movie for me. You know the kind, right? I went through 4 Kleenexes watching it. I absolutely loved it. After I had seen it, I asked a male friend of mine if he had seen it. And he said, oh, that's such a chick flick. You know what? It never occurred to me that it was a chick flick. Maybe it's because I'm a chick. I don't know. But it never occurred to me that it was a chick flick, because I just thought about it as a great story about the greatest racehorse of all time and a determined woman who was expressing her feminine genius. Never occurred to me that it was a chick flick. But you know what? He was a man. And when he watched it, it was a chick flick. Because it was all about a determined woman and relationships. You know what? Do men burp the same as women? Of course not. Men don't burp. They belch, right? I have a son who's now almost 25. And I've watched him grow up. And no one can convince me that we're the same. I can remember how he said to me one time, Mom, all the girls I know have seen The Notebook. And they're trying to get me to see it. It's the stupidest movie. It's all about love.